The bell rang, signaling the start of the school year. Ava stood at the entrance of the school, her heart racing in her chest. She looked up at the tall, intimidating structure before her and took a deep breath. This year was going to be different. This year, she was determined to prove herself, no more holding back. She adjusted her backpack, the weight of it comforting in a way, and started walking toward the piano room. She had always been quiet, always kept to herself, but her piano playing was something else entirely. Music was her escape, her way of speaking when words didn't seem enough. But now, as she approached the door to room 203, she could feel a knot tightening in her stomach. She had heard the rumors about Mr. Lawson, the new piano teacher. Some said he was a genius, others said he was impossible to please. All Ava knew was that she couldn't afford to let him intimidate her. Ava pushed open the door, and the cool air of the room hit her face. There were a few students scattered around, some practicing on the pianos, others chatting idly. But there, in the corner of the room, sitting behind a desk with a stack of papers in front of him, was Mr. Lawson. He was an older man, with salt and pepper hair, a pair of glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and an air of authority that instantly made the room quieter. Ava hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, trying to steady her breath. She glanced around, searching for a seat that was far from Mr. Lawson's watchful eyes. She knew how quickly teachers could make assumptions, and she wasn't sure she was ready for him to judge her before she even had the chance to prove herself. Mr. Lawson didn't look up from his papers as she walked in. He didn't even greet her. Instead, he turned the page, scribbled something down, and then, as if on cue, spoke without looking at her. "You're Ava, right? The quiet one." Ava's heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? She'd barely even said anything. She nodded, unsure of what to say. "Right. Well, let's see what you're made of then." His voice was cold, almost dismissive. It sent a chill down her spine. Ava sat down at one of the grand pianos in the corner, her hands shaking slightly as they rested on the keys. She knew that first impressions were important, but what could she possibly show him in such a short time? She wasn't about to play anything too extravagant, she didn't want to come off as too eager or too much of a show-off. But she had to play something. Anything. So, she started with the first piece that came to her mind, Beethoven's For Elise. As the notes began to fill the room, she focused all her energy into playing them perfectly. She wasn't playing for him. She wasn't playing for anyone. She was playing for herself. She closed her eyes and let the music flow through her fingertips. The soft, rhythmic melody calmed her nerves, allowing her to forget about the pressure. This was her element. This was where she could be herself. But just as the music reached a delicate crescendo, Mr. Lawson's voice interrupted her. "Is that all you've got?" he asked, his tone mocking, sharp enough to make her flinch. He looked up at her now, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm afraid we're not here for nursery rhymes. Try something a little more challenging, if you please." Ava's fingers froze above the keys, the dissonant note ringing in the air. She opened her eyes to find Mr. Lawson staring at her, waiting for her to respond. Her heart sank, the small shred of confidence she had built up slipping away in an instant. She could feel the eyes of the other students on her now, the silence of the room becoming more oppressive. She had expected criticism, but this felt different, this felt personal. I can do better," she stammered, looking down at the keys. She didn't know what else to say. She had spent so long learning, practicing, pouring her soul into the music. And yet, here she was, feeling like none of it mattered. Mr. Lawson raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He turned back to his papers, effectively dismissing her. "We'll see if you can live up to your potential, Ava," he muttered under his breath, as if she weren't even in the room. Ava's fingers trembled as she slowly stood up from the piano. The familiar sting of self-doubt crept in, and she quickly made her way to the back of the room, trying to hide her embarrassment. She took a seat in the back row, away from the others, hoping the floor would swallow her whole. "Don't let him get to you," a voice whispered from beside her. Ava turned to see Emily, her best friend since middle school, sitting next to her. Emily always knew the right thing to say, even when it didn't feel like there was any hope. Ava forced a smile. "I don't know. He doesn't think I'm good enough. What if he's right?" Emily shook her head, her dark curls bouncing as she did. "You know better than that. You've got something special, Ava. Don't let him tell you otherwise." But even as she said the words, Ava wasn't sure she believed them. How could she, when her teacher didn't even give her a chance? She glanced at the other students, who were all busy with their own work, and felt the weight of the judgment that seemed to hang in the air. She was used to people doubting her, being quiet, being the other girl in a predominantly white school. It wasn't new. But this was different. This was her passion, her talent, her music. And he was dismissing it as though it meant nothing. As the class continued, Ava barely heard the lessons, her mind clouded with thoughts of Mr. Lawson's sharp words. He didn't understand her. He didn't understand what music meant to her, or how much it had carried her through difficult times. How could he, when he barely took the time to look past her skin, her background, and her quiet nature? She glanced back at Mr. Lawson, who was still distracted with his papers, his posture rigid and unyielding. Ava knew one thing for sure. Her mom had always told her, "People will try to hold you back, Ava. But you've got to rise above it. Music will always be your voice, even when they try to silence you." Ava clenched her fists under the table, silently vowing that no matter how Mr. Lawson treated her, she would not give up. She would prove him wrong. She would show him that she was more than just the quiet girl in the back of the class. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, and the students began to file out of the room. Ava remained in her seat for a moment longer, her mind racing. As she stood up, Emily gave her a quick smile. "Don't let him get to you," she repeated, and this time, Ava nodded, more to herself than anyone else. She walked out of the classroom, a sense of determination beginning to take root in her chest. This was just the beginning. She wouldn't let a teacher, or anyone else, tell her what she was capable of. The world hadn't seen the real Ava yet. And soon, they would. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ava had never been one to seek the spotlight. She preferred to stay in the background, hidden behind the walls she'd carefully built around herself. It wasn't always this way, though. There was a time when she believed her dreams could take her anywhere, even places she could hardly imagine. But life had a way of pulling her in unexpected directions, forcing her to adapt and grow in ways she never anticipated. Ava's story began in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, with a mother who always worked long hours to make ends meet. Karen, her mother, was Ava's rock. She was the kind of woman who never complained, no matter how hard things got. She had raised Ava on her own, without the help of Ava's father, who had disappeared from their lives when Ava was only 5. Her mom never talked much about him, but Ava knew enough to understand that he wasn't coming back. At first, Ava hadn't minded much. She had her mom, and that was all she needed. Karen was more than just a mother, she was Ava's best friend, her confidant, and her biggest cheerleader. They spent hours together, talking about everything from school to the future, and the dreams that both of them held on to. "You know, Ava," Karen would say as they sat at the kitchen table, "there's no limit to what you can do, baby. As long as you work hard and stay true to yourself, you'll go places." Ava had always taken her mother's words to heart. But deep down, she knew her mother was only trying to protect her, trying to build her up so she wouldn't have to face the harsh realities of their world. In a neighborhood where everyone seemed to be struggling, Ava had learned early on to keep her head down. She had learned to avoid trouble, to steer clear of the wrong crowd, and to focus on what mattered most, her music. Ava's connection to music wasn't just a hobby. It was her refuge. When life became overwhelming, she would find solace in the keys of the piano, where the world seemed to disappear. There was something magical about how her fingers could dance across the ivory keys, how every note seemed to speak the words she couldn't say. It was her escape, her way of processing everything, her fears, her anxieties, her hopes for the future. Music made her feel like she belonged to something bigger than herself, something outside of the confines of her small world. When she was 10, her mother had scraped together enough money to buy a used keyboard for Ava's birthday. It wasn't much, but it was the greatest gift Ava had ever received. For the first time in her life, she had an instrument to call her own. She spent hours with that keyboard, learning every song she could, whether it was pop music or classical pieces that she stumbled upon in old music books at the library. As Ava grew older, her love for the piano deepened. But she wasn't just playing for fun anymore, she was playing for something more. She was playing to prove to herself that she was worthy, that she could make something of herself, even in a world that often overlooked people like her. Music became her language, her way of expressing the things she couldn't put into words. Her mother noticed the change in her. "You've got a gift, Ava. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise," Karen would say, always with that quiet but fierce belief in her eyes. But the world outside their small apartment complex wasn't always as kind. School was a place where Ava felt invisible most of the time. She wasn't the popular girl, and she wasn't the smartest kid in the class. She was just there. A quiet, reserved girl who preferred the company of her music over the noise of high school cliques. She'd had friends growing up, but over the years, they drifted apart. High school was a place where labels and judgments were unavoidable, and Ava wasn't always sure where she fit in. Despite her introversion, Ava had always been good at making people feel comfortable around her. She didn't seek attention, but somehow, people often found themselves confiding in her. It was as if they could sense that she understood them, even without saying much. But this ability to connect with others didn't make her immune to the harsh realities of being an African American girl in a predominantly white school. Ava had learned early on to face microaggressions and to ignore the whispers behind her back. But it still stung. Every time a teacher assumed she wasn't capable of something or a student looked at her as if she didn't belong, it hurt. She knew that she was more than the stereotypes people saw, but sometimes, it was hard to prove that when no one gave her the chance. Ava's music, however, was a different story. When she played the piano, none of that mattered. She wasn't Ava the quiet girl from the wrong side of town. She was just Ava, the musician. The notes that flowed from her fingers felt like freedom, like a declaration to the world that she was more than they thought she was. But the world wasn't always kind to people like her. And that reality hit her hardest when her mother fell ill. It started as a mild cough, something that Karen shrugged off as just a cold. But as the weeks went on, the cough grew worse, and she began to feel more fatigued than usual. Ava tried not to worry. Her mom had always been strong, and she didn't want to believe that anything could be seriously wrong. But then Karen was diagnosed with a chronic illness, one that left her struggling to keep up with the demands of work and household responsibilities. The burden of it all fell on Ava's shoulders. At just 15, she had to grow up faster than she ever thought she would. There were days when Ava would sit at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys, but her mind would be elsewhere, consumed with worry for her mother. But she never stopped playing. She couldn't. Music was her way of coping, of keeping her grounded in a world that seemed to be falling apart around her. "Mom, it's going to be okay," Ava would whisper during those long, quiet nights, when they sat together on the couch, her mom resting her head on Ava's shoulder. Karen would smile faintly and squeeze her hand. "I know, baby. I know. You've got this." But sometimes, Ava wasn't so sure. Despite everything, Ava kept pushing forward. She kept playing, kept learning, kept dreaming of a future where she could use her music to change the world. She wasn't sure how it would happen, but she knew she couldn't give up. And so, she stepped into Mr. Lawson's piano class, her heart filled with both fear and hope. Because, deep down, Ava knew one thing for sure: no matter what anyone said, music was hers. And she would not let anyone take it away from her. Ava woke up the next day with a gnawing sense of dread. Her first encounter with Mr. Lawson had shaken her confidence more than she wanted to admit. The sting of his dismissive words still echoed in her ears. The thing about Mr. Lawson was that he wasn't like other teachers. He didn't sugarcoat things, and he didn't hold back. But that didn't make it easier. He wasn't just criticizing her skills, he was questioning her worth, as though her talent meant nothing unless it met his high standards. It was a thought that hung heavy on her mind as she walked into the piano room the next day, clutching her music notebook tightly. She was determined to prove herself today. She wasn't going to let one bad encounter define her. As she entered the room, she was greeted by the familiar sound of piano keys being played softly in the background. Some students were already practicing, their fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys. Ava walked over to an empty piano, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her chest. She could feel Mr. Lawson's eyes on her from across the room, but this time, she wouldn't let his gaze rattle her. She took a seat, laid her hands on the piano, and began playing one of her favorite pieces, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The song had always been her go-to when she needed to calm her nerves, a piece that had become a part of her soul over the years. The notes seemed to flow from her fingertips naturally, the melody rising and falling with ease. For a moment, she was lost in the music, the world outside of the piano room fading away. But as soon as she hit the final note, she heard Mr. Lawson's voice, sharp and critical. "Not bad," he said, but there was no praise in his tone. "It's clear you've been practicing. But you're holding back. Your playing is tentative. You're not letting the music take over. You're too concerned about making mistakes. Play it again, but this time, let it breathe. Let it speak for you." Ava's heart sank. She had given it her all. What did he mean she was holding back? She wanted to argue, but she didn't. She had learned to keep quiet, to avoid confrontation, and instead, she simply nodded. "I can do that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Lawson didn't respond. He just turned back to his desk, as if he had already lost interest. Ava could feel the weight of his silence pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what he was expecting from her, but she was determined to give it another try. This time, she focused even more, closing her eyes as her fingers traced the keys. She poured every ounce of herself into the music, hoping to break through the barrier Mr. Lawson had put up between them. When she finished, she felt a surge of emotion, her chest tight from the effort. But when she opened her eyes, there was no sign of approval from Mr. Lawson. Instead, he gave a small, dismissive shrug. "You still don't get it," he muttered, not even bothering to look her in the eye. "You're not playing from your heart. You're too focused on being perfect. This isn't a recital. It's supposed to be an expression of yourself, your soul. You've got to let go of that fear. Until you do, you'll never get any better." Ava's hands trembled as she stood up from the piano. His words hit her like a punch in the gut. "You're not good enough." That's what she heard, even if he didn't say it directly. She had always been told that hard work would pay off. But no matter how much effort she put into her music, it felt like it was never enough. She made her way to the back of the room, trying to hold herself together. She could feel the eyes of the other students on her, their glances filled with a mix of curiosity and pity. It was as though they knew she had just failed, and somehow, it made her feel even smaller. Ava wanted to disappear. She didn't want to be the center of attention anymore. She didn't want to feel like a failure. Emily, who had been silently watching from the back, approached her after class. She was quick to put a comforting hand on Ava's shoulder. "Don't listen to him," Emily said, her voice a soft comfort in the storm of Ava's emotions. "Mr. Lawson doesn't get it. He's not the one who understands you. You are so much more than that." Ava let out a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. I've been practicing for years, and still I can't get it right." Emily shook her head, her curls bouncing as she did. "Ava, you've been practicing for years. That's something. Not everyone has the dedication you do. Don't let him make you doubt yourself. You're one of the most talented people I know." Ava wanted to believe her. She really did. But the doubt was creeping in, pulling at the edges of her mind. Maybe Emily was just saying it to make her feel better, but Mr. Lawson's words had hit too hard. The thing was, Ava had always been afraid of failing. She had always been afraid of being seen as less than others, less than perfect, less than what the world expected of her. That evening, as Ava sat in her room, the weight of the day seemed unbearable. She opened her notebook and started jotting down her thoughts, letting the words spill out. The paper filled up quickly with a jumble of emotions: anger, frustration, confusion. She was scared. She didn't want to admit it, but she was terrified that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough. But in the midst of it all, she felt a flicker of something deep inside her that wouldn't be snuffed out. "You've got this, Ava," she whispered to herself, the words a quiet promise. It was in that moment, as the night closed in around her, that she realized she had a choice to make. She could either let Mr. Lawson's words define her, or she could use them as fuel. She could prove to him, and to herself, that she was worth something. She wasn't going to give up. Not this time. Ava grabbed her piano book, flipped to the next page, and began to play. She didn't care about mistakes anymore. She didn't care about being perfect. This time, she was playing for herself. And that was the beginning of something bigger than she could have imagined. The next few days were a blur for Ava. After her encounter with Mr. Lawson, she spent most of her time practicing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every note she played seemed to carry the weight of his judgment. The more she played, the more self-doubt crept in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she would never measure up to the expectations set by someone like him? But despite her anxiety, Ava couldn't let go of the piano. It was her safe space. No matter how many times she faltered, the music always welcomed her back, and in those moments, she found solace. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, a comforting reminder that she could do anything if she worked hard enough. Ava was in the middle of playing a complex piece by Beethoven one afternoon when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Mr. Lawson standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. "Again," he said simply, his tone flat. Ava's heart sank. She had been playing the piece perfectly, at least, she thought she had. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stood up, unsure whether to argue or comply. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was good this time." "It's not about whether it sounds good or not," Mr. Lawson replied, his voice more intense than before. "You're still playing as if you're afraid of making a mistake. You need to stop holding yourself back." Ava's brow furrowed. "But I don't know how to stop," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I can't just let go. Every time I try, I mess up." "Exactly," he said, his voice softening. "That's the point. You're not going to get better by trying to be perfect all the time. You have to learn to embrace the mistakes. The mistakes are where you'll learn the most." Ava stood there, staring at him, trying to make sense of his words. She had always been taught to avoid mistakes. To practice until everything was flawless. It was hard for her to wrap her mind around the idea of actually embracing mistakes. But something in Mr. Lawson's tone told her he wasn't just giving her empty advice. He truly believed this. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted, her voice small. "You can," Mr. Lawson said, his gaze steady. "You're capable of more than you realize. But you have to trust yourself. The more you try to control everything, the more you stifle your own talent." Ava's chest tightened. She had always been told to be in control, to push herself to be perfect. How could she suddenly let go of that mentality? But before she could answer, he spoke again, this time with a surprising amount of seriousness. "I'm going to give you a challenge. Next week, I want you to play a piece you've never practiced before. Something completely new. No practice, no preparation. Just go up there and play. And don't try to make it perfect. I want you to feel the music, not just play the notes. Can you do that?" Ava's heart skipped a beat. A challenge? Something new? The thought terrified her, but there was something in his voice that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was the key to what she had been missing. I can try," she said hesitantly. Mr. Lawson gave a small nod. "Good. You're capable of more than just being good enough. You have potential. Don't let fear control it." Ava watched him leave, her mind swirling with uncertainty. She had no idea what piece he wanted her to play, and the idea of stepping into the unknown was more intimidating than she could put into words. But despite the fear creeping in, she knew she couldn't back down. She couldn't let herself be defeated so easily. That night, as she sat at her piano, Ava thought about Mr. Lawson's words. "You're capable of more than just being good enough." The words echoed in her mind, pushing her forward. She closed her eyes, letting the music flow through her fingers. She didn't care about the mistakes anymore. For the first time, she let herself just play. It wasn't perfect, and that was okay. The next day, she went to the library and searched through music books, picking out a piece she had never played before. It was an unfamiliar piece by Rachmaninoff, with complex rhythms and fast-paced movements. She knew it would be difficult, but that's exactly why she chose it. Ava knew it was time to stop hiding behind what was comfortable. She had to face the challenge head-on. She spent the next few days practicing the new piece. She struggled at first, but each time she played, she felt herself growing. She had always been scared of making mistakes, but she was starting to realize that mistakes weren't the end. They were just a part of the process. As the week passed, Ava grew more and more excited about the challenge Mr. Lawson had given her. She wasn't sure what would happen when she stood in front of the class to perform the piece, but one thing was clear, she wasn't going to hold herself back anymore. When the day of her performance came, Ava felt the familiar nerves bubble up inside her. But this time, instead of allowing those nerves to control her, she embraced them. She had prepared herself for this moment, and she was going to give it everything she had. Mr. Lawson stood at the back of the room, arms folded, watching her intently. The other students sat in silence, their eyes fixed on her. Ava took a deep breath, her fingers resting lightly on the piano keys. And then, she began. At first, the notes were shaky, hesitant. She stumbled a few times, unsure of the rhythms, but she didn't stop. She pushed forward, playing through the mistakes, allowing the music to take over. With each passing moment, she became more confident, more connected to the piece. She wasn't worried about perfection anymore, she was just playing. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Ava's chest rose and fell rapidly, her heart racing. She looked up at Mr. Lawson, uncertain of what he would say. To her surprise, he gave a small smile and nodded. "Not bad, Ava," he said, his tone warmer than she had expected. "Not bad at all. It wasn't much, but it was enough." For the first time in a long time, Ava felt like she had proven something to herself. She wasn't just trying to be good enough anymore. She was learning to let go, to embrace her mistakes, and to trust herself. And that was just the beginning. Ava couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly proud of herself. As the days passed after her performance, she found herself replaying the moment over and over in her mind, not because of Mr. Lawson's praise, though that had meant more than she had expected, but because of how she had felt in that moment. For the first time, she had let go. She had embraced the imperfections, and something inside her had shifted. But that shift, as liberating as it felt, was also terrifying. What came next? Was this newfound freedom enough to carry her through the rest of the challenges ahead? Could she continue to push herself beyond the barriers she had set, or would she fall back into the comfort of avoiding risks? Ava found herself asking these questions more and more, and with each passing day, they became louder, more insistent. Her confidence was fragile, like a bird learning to fly for the first time. One gust of wind, one misstep, and it could all come crashing down. It was a Wednesday afternoon when it happened. Ava had arrived early to the piano room, as she had done every day for the past week, ready to practice the new piece she had chosen. But as she walked in, she saw Mr. Lawson talking to another student, Jason, who was sitting at the grand piano, eagerly awaiting his turn to play. Jason, like many of the students, was one of the golden children of the school, a student whose talent was seemingly effortless. He was confident, a favorite of the teachers, and one of the best pianists in the class. Ava hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to go in or wait outside. Jason's presence always had a way of making her feel smaller, like she didn't belong in the same space. But today, something inside her shifted. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let anyone or anything stop her. Ava took a deep breath and walked into the room, her footsteps soft but purposeful. Jason looked up from the piano as she approached. "Oh, hey Ava," he said with a smirk, "you practicing for your big solo?" Ava froze, her mind instantly filled with self-doubt. It was a harmless comment, but the way Jason said it made her feel like an outsider, like her presence here was somehow a joke. She hadn't even considered the idea of a solo, her heart clenched at the thought of having to perform alone in front of an audience. She had barely been able to perform the piece in front of the class, and now the idea of doing it in front of a full audience made her feel sick. "I'm just practicing," she replied, forcing a smile. "You know, just trying to get better." Jason chuckled and turned back to the piano. Sure. Good luck with that." Ava stood there, the sting of his words lingering in the air. The doubt that had been slowly creeping back into her mind suddenly exploded into full force. Was she just fooling herself? Did Mr. Lawson really see something in her, or was she just wasting everyone's time? What if Jason was right? What if she wasn't good enough to compete with students like him? Her fingers shook as she sat down at the piano. She placed her hands over the keys, but the familiar sense of comfort didn't come. Instead, her thoughts spiraled, and the music that usually flowed so naturally felt distant, foreign. She tried to play, but the notes didn't sound right. She couldn't focus. Every mistake felt amplified. Ava's frustration mounted. "Why can't I just get this right?" she muttered to herself. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away before anyone could see. But it was no use. The weight of her insecurities was too heavy. She was overwhelmed, and there was no way to hide from it. It wasn't until she heard the soft, reassuring voice of Emily that she snapped out of her downward spiral. "Ava?" Ava turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her expression gentle. She had been watching from afar, no doubt noticing the tension that had been building in the room. I don't know what's wrong," Ava admitted, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm not getting anywhere. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough. Mr. Lawson, Jason, everyone, none of them see me. I'm just invisible here. I'll never be as good as they are." Emily walked over to Ava, her presence grounding. "You're not invisible, Ava," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're just too focused on what everyone else thinks. You have this incredible talent, and it's already there. You don't need their approval to see it. You just have to believe in yourself. Ava felt the sting of her words. She had heard them before from Emily, but today, they hit differently. She had always struggled to believe in herself. She had always been afraid of failure, of letting people down, and of falling short of expectations. But Emily was right. She was letting the noise of others drown out her own voice. You've got to stop worrying about what they think, Emily continued. You're your own biggest critic, and I get it. It's tough. But you're playing for yourself, not for them. You're doing this because you love it, not because anyone else says you should. And no matter what, you're enough. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Emily, truly seeing her for the first time. Emily wasn't just offering comfort, she was offering the kind of truth that Ava desperately needed to hear. She had been so focused on proving herself to everyone else, she had forgotten why she started playing in the first place. Her hands trembled, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from a realization that washed over her like a wave. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to embrace that truth. I don't need to be perfect, Ava whispered to herself, the weight of her insecurities slowly lifting. I don't need to impress anyone. Ava sat down at the piano once again. This time, her fingers moved with purpose, not with fear of mistakes but with the simple joy of playing. She didn't need validation from Jason or anyone else. She was good enough, just as she was. As the music filled the room, Ava felt the tension slip away, replaced by a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. Mr. Lawson watched from the doorway, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I told you, he murmured under his breath, you just had to let go. And for the first time, Ava truly did. The following weeks passed by in a haze for Ava, but for the first time, the haze felt lighter. She wasn't as weighed down by the expectations of others, and the music flowed more freely from her fingers. She spent hours at the piano, letting each piece teach her something new about herself. The mistakes that used to paralyze her were now just part of the process. And though she still felt the occasional pang of doubt, she had learned to silence it, to keep moving forward. But Ava knew the true test was still to come. Mr. Lawson's challenge wasn't over. He had set the bar high, and she had only scratched the surface. Every day felt like a race against time, as she tried to balance her studies, her practice, and her growing inner turmoil. Was she truly ready for the big performance he had promised? Was she ready to face her fears in front of the entire class? One afternoon, Ava sat on the bench, her fingers resting on the keys, staring at the sheet music in front of her. The Rachmaninoff piece had become both her salvation and her burden. There were moments when it felt like she could conquer it, and others when it felt like an insurmountable mountain. But she wasn't about to quit now, not when she had come this far. She looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with concern. Ava? Emily said, stepping inside. You've been here for hours. Don't you need a break? Ava shook her head, unable to explain the restlessness that had taken over her. I can't. Not yet. I still don't feel ready. I don't know if I ever will be. Emily walked over, sitting beside her. You've come a long way. You're so much stronger than you think. I can see it. Don't let fear hold you back now. Ava's chest tightened, her breath quickening. She hated this feeling, the feeling of not being enough. It was like she was standing on the edge of something huge, but every time she tried to take the next step, she was frozen. I don't know if I can do this, Ava whispered, her voice cracking. Emily looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. Ava, no one is asking you to be perfect. Not even Mr. Lawson. He just wants you to try, to show up, and to be yourself. And that's all you can do. The rest will fall into place. Ava closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Emily's words settled into her mind, but there was still a piece of her that wanted to argue. It wasn't enough just to show up. She wanted to succeed. She wanted to prove that she could be more than just the shy, insecure girl who struggled to fit in. But deep down, she knew Emily was right. She couldn't control everything. She couldn't force herself to be perfect. All she could do was take that step forward, even if it felt terrifying. The night before her performance, Ava lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her heart raced, and her mind was a whirlwind of self-doubt. Was she really ready for this? The thought of stepping on that stage, with everyone watching, made her feel like she might crumble under the pressure. But then she remembered the music. She remembered how it felt when she let herself feel the notes, when she wasn't focused on the mistakes but on the story the music told. That was the key. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be real. With that thought in mind, Ava drifted into a restless sleep. The day of the performance arrived sooner than she expected. Ava stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress. Her hands shook slightly as she ran a brush through her hair. She was nervous, terrified even, but she refused to let it stop her. Today, she would face her fear. As she entered the classroom, the other students were already seated, waiting for their turn. Jason, as usual, was at the front, his smug smile plastered on his face. Ava didn't pay him any attention. Instead, she found her seat and sat quietly, her mind focused on the music, on what was to come. Mr. Lawson stood at the front, a silent figure of authority. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on Ava, he gave her a small, encouraging nod. She swallowed hard, but the knot in her stomach loosened slightly. He believed in her. When it was her turn to perform, Ava stood up, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. She made her way to the piano, and the room seemed to quiet in anticipation. She glanced at the sheet music once, then placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, everything went silent in her mind. There was only the music, and the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. She began. The first few notes were shaky, she could feel the tremor in her fingers, but she didn't stop. She played through the mistakes, just as Mr. Lawson had told her to. As the music grew more complex, she leaned into it, letting it guide her. The faster passages were a blur, her fingers dancing across the keys, and the slower ones gave her a chance to breathe, to find her grounding. For the first time in a long time, Ava wasn't thinking about what everyone else thought. She wasn't worrying about how she looked or if she made a mistake. She was playing for herself. The audience might be watching, but it didn't matter. She had nothing to prove. She was just a girl playing music she loved. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, and Ava's heart raced. She hadn't expected applause, but the quiet was deafening. She looked up and saw Mr. Lawson's steady gaze, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, pride, maybe, or approval. Finally, the class broke into applause, and Ava felt a rush of relief flood through her. She wasn't sure if her performance had been flawless, but she didn't care. The fear that had once gripped her was gone. She had faced it. She had done it. Mr. Lawson nodded approvingly. "Well done, Ava," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's the kind of performance I was hoping for." Ava's chest swelled with pride, her heart soaring. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just a student in the back of the room. She was someone who had found her voice. And this was only the beginning. The applause from her performance still echoed in Ava's mind as she returned to her seat, heart pounding but filled with a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. For the first time in ages, she felt like she had truly earned something. It wasn't just the applause. It wasn't just the validation from Mr. Lawson or the other students. It was the knowledge that she had pushed through her own insecurities and fears to stand there, confident in her own ability. But just as the sense of triumph began to settle, an unexpected challenge arrived. Mr. Lawson's voice cut through the buzz of chatter in the room. All right, class, he said, looking over everyone. Now that we've seen some of your pieces, it's time to raise the bar. I'm assigning a new challenge for everyone. A competition. Your next performance will be in front of the entire school, and I expect you all to take it seriously. Ava's stomach sank. The room fell silent, every student's attention riveted on Mr. Lawson. A competition? Jason's voice broke the stillness, his tone a mix of excitement and a little too much self-assurance. You mean we're actually going to perform for the whole school? That's right, Mr. Lawson confirmed, his gaze sweeping over the class. You'll each choose a piece you feel will best showcase your abilities. But there's a twist, you'll be judged on how well you adapt to changes in the piece mid-performance. Expect the unexpected. Ava's heart thudded in her chest. The idea of performing for the entire school, of being exposed on that level, was enough to make her dizzy. But the part about being judged on her ability to adapt? That sounded terrifying. What if she made a mistake and couldn't recover? What if she froze? She glanced around the room. Jason was already grinning, clearly confident. His fingers itched to get back to the piano, no doubt imagining his flawless performance. But Ava wasn't Jason. She didn't have that same self-assurance, that cocky ease. She had worked hard, yes, but the thought of being thrown off track in the middle of a performance sent a ripple of panic through her. Everyone, choose your pieces by the end of the week, Mr. Lawson said. I'll be working with each of you individually to help you prepare. As the class disbanded, Ava gathered her things slowly. She could feel Emily's presence beside her, but she couldn't look up. Her mind was spinning. A competition? In front of the entire school. Ava, hey, Emily said softly, breaking into her thoughts. You okay? Ava nodded, though the tightness in her chest made it hard to breathe. Yeah. I guess. It's just, a lot. A competition, in front of everyone. And then we have to deal with changes mid-performance. I don't know if I can do it. Emily smiled reassuringly. You've got this, Ava. You've already proven to yourself how far you can go. This is just another step. You've been working hard, and I know you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. Ava appreciated Emily's confidence in her, but it didn't erase the fear gnawing at her. But what if I mess up? That's the point, right? Emily said with a wink. You won't know unless you try. And you can always recover. Plus, you've got me cheering you on. Ava couldn't help but smile, grateful for Emily's unwavering support. But even as she smiled, the fear still lurked at the edges of her mind. The performance was looming, and so was the pressure. The next few days were a blur for Ava. She spent every spare moment in the practice room, going over different pieces, trying to decide which one would be the right choice. Every time she thought she had one, doubt crept in. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to stand up in front of the whole school and let herself be judged. Mr. Lawson had been giving one-on-one sessions with each student, and Ava's was scheduled for the next afternoon. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or nervous about it, he was such an enigmatic figure to her. At times, he seemed like he was rooting for her, but other times, it was as if he were silently judging her every move. That afternoon, Ava found herself walking into the practice room, where Mr. Lawson was already seated at the piano, waiting for her. Have a seat, he said, gesturing toward the bench. Let's see what you've chosen for the competition. Ava took a deep breath and sat down. She opened her sheet music to the Rachmaninoff piece she had been practicing. She wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but it was the piece she felt most connected to. I've been practicing this, she said quietly. But I'm worried I'm not good enough for the competition. I mean, the changes in the middle of the performance, what if I can't recover? Mr. Lawson looked at her thoughtfully. Ava, the most important thing you can do is embrace the unexpected. Music is unpredictable. Even the best pianists make mistakes. It's how you recover that counts. What will matter most is your ability to keep going, even when things don't go as planned. Ava swallowed, trying to focus on his words. But I'm not as good as the other students. They're all so confident. They know what they're doing. I feel like I'm just fumbling around. Mr. Lawson smiled, a rare, almost gentle smile. Confidence comes from trusting yourself, Ava. You've been holding yourself back because you're afraid to make mistakes. But the truth is, you've already come a long way. You're not the same person who walked into this room months ago. Ava's throat tightened. I don't know if I'm ready for this. Mr. Lawson's expression softened. You don't need to be ready for everything right now. You just need to keep moving forward. One step at a time. Ava nodded, but a knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. She wasn't sure if she could do it, but for the first time, she realized that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about having the courage to step up and try. She took a deep breath and began to play. The next few days felt like a pressure cooker slowly building up around Ava. She spent hours in the practice room, often losing track of time as she tried to perfect her piece. But no matter how hard she worked, doubt still lingered. The competition was approaching, and she didn't feel ready. Every time she sat at the piano, the keys seemed to mock her. Her fingers stumbled over the notes, her mind racing with fears of making a mistake. The fear of being exposed in front of the entire school was overwhelming. She had worked so hard to get this far, but the thought of failing in front of so many people felt like a weight she couldn't shake off. It didn't help that Jason seemed more confident than ever. He had been walking around the school, already talking about how he planned to blow everyone away with his performance. He had that cocky attitude, the kind that made Ava's stomach churn. It wasn't just that he was arrogant, it was that he was so sure of himself, so ready to perform without a hint of hesitation. He made it seem so easy. Ava tried not to let his attitude get to her, but it was hard not to compare herself to him. Jason didn't seem to worry about mistakes, he just played, and it was beautiful. Ava, on the other hand, felt like every note was a battle. The day before the competition, she sat at the piano, staring at the sheet music in front of her. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but she couldn't bring herself to start playing. She couldn't shake the fear that if she made one wrong move, the whole thing would fall apart. Her mind spiraled into panic. Maybe I should choose a different piece, she muttered to herself, trying to push the fear away. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. Even if she picked a new piece, the same doubts would follow her. She wasn't ready. She wasn't good enough. Just then, Emily's voice broke through her thoughts. Ava, hey. You're not alone in this, you know. Ava looked up to find her friend standing in the doorway, a concerned look on her face. You've been practicing non-stop. You need a break. Ava shook her head. I can't stop now. I'm so close to messing up, and I can't afford to do that. Emily walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. I know you're scared, but you're not going to mess up. You've already come so far. What you're doing now is incredible. You've got more strength than you realize. Ava didn't say anything at first. Instead, she just stared at the piano keys, trying to calm her breathing. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to believe Emily, but the nagging voice in the back of her mind kept telling her that she wasn't enough. I can't do this in front of everyone, Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I make a mistake? What if I freeze up? Emily knelt beside her and looked her in the eye. Ava, it's okay to make mistakes. You don't have to be perfect. The point isn't to be flawless, it's to be real. People will respect you more for showing up and being authentic than for pretending to be perfect. Ava let out a shaky breath. But I'm not ready for this. You're more ready than you think, Emily said softly. You've already proven you can face your fears. Don't let this competition be the thing that holds you back. Ava closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. Emily was right, she had come this far, hadn't she? But what if the stakes were higher than she was capable of? What if she made a fool of herself in front of the entire school? The next day, the school auditorium was buzzing with nervous energy. Ava stood backstage, staring out at the rows of empty seats. The sound of muffled chatter from the audience drifted through the walls, but it only made Ava's nerves flare up. She could feel her palms sweating, her stomach twisted in knots. This was it. The moment she had both feared and looked forward to was finally here. The other students were scattered around, some pacing nervously, others chatting excitedly about the performance. Jason was already at the front, warming up with a confident smile on his face. Ava couldn't help but glance over at him. His posture was relaxed, his fingers moving effortlessly over the keys as he practiced. How did he do it? How did he look so at ease? Ava. Emily called from behind her. You okay? Ava turned to face her friend, taking a deep breath. I don't know. I'm so nervous. You've got this, Emily said with a reassuring smile. Just remember, breathe, focus on the music, and keep going no matter what happens. People are going to be impressed, but they're going to be even more impressed by how you handle whatever comes your way. Ava nodded, forcing a small smile. Thanks, Emily. Before Ava could say anything else, Mr. Lawson appeared, walking toward the stage. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything else faded. It was just him, and it was as if he saw straight through her nerves, straight through the facade she had built. You're up next, Ava, he said calmly. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She felt like she might crumble under the weight of it all. But then, for a brief moment, she thought of everything that had led her here, the hours of practice, the breakthroughs, the progress. This wasn't just about winning. It was about proving something to herself. She took one last deep breath and walked toward the stage. The spotlight hit her as she sat at the piano, the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. The audience was silent, waiting. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, louder than anything else. But then, as her fingers hovered above the keys, she closed her eyes for just a moment. She could hear the music, feel it in her bones. She wasn't just playing to perform, she was playing to connect with something deeper inside of her. With a deep breath, Ava began. The first note rang out in the silence of the auditorium, pure and clear. Ava's fingers trembled slightly over the keys, but she steadied herself. The music began to flow, and for a moment, she felt at peace. Her fears and anxieties seemed to melt away, if only for a few precious seconds. She could hear the delicate harmonies filling the room, and she let herself get lost in the music. But then, in the middle of a particularly complex passage, her fingers faltered. It wasn't a huge mistake, but it was enough to make her stomach lurch. For a split second, she hesitated, unsure of what to do. The auditorium felt enormous, and she imagined the audience staring at her, waiting for her to mess up. Her heart raced as the panic began to creep back in. She had promised herself she wouldn't freeze, that she would keep going no matter what. But what if she couldn't? Suddenly, she remembered Mr. Lawson's words, "It's not about perfection. It's about how you recover." Ava took a deep breath, forcing herself to refocus. Her hands moved to the next chord as if nothing had happened, and the music flowed again. She didn't dwell on the mistake. She couldn't afford to. She was halfway through the piece when a new challenge hit her. A sharp, unexpected shift in the melody, exactly like Mr. Lawson had warned. Her fingers faltered again, the familiar panic rising in her chest. This time, the notes seemed to slip away from her grasp completely. She knew she had to adapt. The music was swirling around her, and her mind raced, but Ava fought to stay grounded. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to nail every note. All she had to do was keep playing. No matter what. Her fingers moved, almost without thinking, as she adjusted the melody on the fly. She couldn't hear the mistakes she had made before, and that was okay. She had to trust herself. With a deep breath, she powered through the rest of the piece. By the time she reached the final chords, Ava felt like she had emerged from a storm. Her heart was pounding, her palms sweating, but there was a sense of triumph swelling within her. She had faced the pressure head-on and hadn't let the mistakes define her. The last note resonated in the room. It hung in the air for a brief moment before fading into the silence. Ava sat there for a few seconds, unsure if she should look up, unsure of what to expect. The silence seemed deafening. She could feel her nerves again, that familiar twist in her stomach. What if the audience had noticed her faltering? Then, slowly, the sound of applause filled the room, soft at first, but gradually building in intensity. Ava's breath caught in her throat. They were applauding. They had heard the mistakes, but they still appreciated the performance. She stood up, bowing slightly, her legs shaky beneath her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but in a way she never had before. The applause wasn't just for her music. It was for the bravery she had shown in the face of uncertainty. For the fact that she had kept going, even when she thought she couldn't. She glanced over at the other students backstage. Jason was staring at her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something like respect. Ava didn't know what to make of it. Maybe he hadn't expected that. Maybe he hadn't expected her to survive her own doubts. As Ava made her way off the stage, Emily was waiting for her, a bright smile on her face. "You did it!" Emily exclaimed, giving her a quick hug. "You were amazing. You didn't freeze, Ava. I'm so proud of you." Ava could hardly believe it herself. Her hands still shook, but the relief that washed over her was overwhelming. She had done it. She had faced the fear of failure and turned it into something more. Mr. Lawson appeared beside her, clapping slowly. His eyes were warm, and there was a hint of something in his gaze that made Ava feel like she had earned his approval. "Not bad at all, Ava," he said, his voice low but appreciative. "You didn't just play the piece. You embraced it. That's what matters. You found your way through the unexpected, just as you should have." Ava looked at him, the nerves still buzzing in her chest but now replaced with a quiet confidence. "I didn't think I could do it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Lawson nodded, his smile softening. "You've been doubting yourself for too long. But you just proved that you don't have to be perfect to succeed. You just have to keep moving forward." Ava swallowed, the words settling deep within her. Just keep moving forward. It was so simple, but it felt like a revelation. Back in the locker room, Ava found a quiet corner to catch her breath. The adrenaline was wearing off, but the emotions from the performance still swirled inside her. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she wiped the sweat from her palms, but there was a strange sense of peace that had settled over her. For the first time in a long time, Ava felt proud of herself. Her thoughts drifted to her family. Her mom would be so proud of her. She couldn't wait to call her after this was over. Then, her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Ava pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the notification. It was a message from Jason. "You did good up there. I didn't think you had it in you." Ava stared at the message, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to say something snarky, to brush it off. But another part of her realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more than rivalry. Perhaps there was respect between them now, something that hadn't existed before. Instead of overthinking it, she typed back a simple response. "Thanks, Jason. That means a lot." She hit send and placed the phone back in her pocket. The competition wasn't over yet, but something had shifted. For the first time, Ava felt like she belonged, not just in the competition, but in the music. She wasn't just a scared girl anymore, she was a musician. And that was something worth celebrating. As the competition progressed, Ava could feel the weight of each performance pushing her further. The auditorium, once just a venue, now seemed like a battleground. But this time, Ava didn't fear the pressure, she was learning to embrace it. The more she played, the more confident she felt, even with the mistakes and missteps that continued to challenge her. But things were changing around her. Jason, who had been so confident in his ability, seemed to have shifted his attitude. He wasn't cocky anymore, not like he had been before. Instead, he was more focused, more determined. It was like the competition had unlocked a new level of intensity in him. Ava watched from the sidelines as Jason sat at the piano, running through his piece one last time before his performance. He was practicing with incredible precision, making sure every note was perfect. His brow furrowed as he played, the usual smirk replaced by a look of determination that Ava had never seen before. She had seen Jason as a rival, but now, she couldn't help but feel like they were both fighting the same battle. It wasn't about who could play better, it was about who could push through the fear and make it to the end. The day of the final performance arrived. The atmosphere in the auditorium was electric, the tension palpable. The crowd filled the seats, murmuring with anticipation. Ava was backstage, pacing nervously. The competition had narrowed down to the final 5 performers, and she was one of them. She was the last performer of the evening. The weight of that felt heavier than anything else. As she looked around, she realized that everyone had their own strategy, their own approach. Some were meditating, others were practicing their final notes, but Ava? She wasn't sure what she was doing. She wasn't sure what to expect. As she fidgeted with her fingers, Emily appeared at her side. "You okay?" she asked, concern in her eyes. Ava nodded, though she didn't feel convinced by her own answer. "I don't know. It's just, everything feels so real now, you know. This is it. This is the moment I've been working for." "You've already won," Emily said with a grin. "Not in the way you think, but you've already done something incredible. You've faced your fears. You're standing here. That's huge." Ava smiled weakly. She wanted to believe that, but the anxiety was still there, gnawing at her. She could hear the distant murmur of the crowd as the previous performance finished. The spotlight would soon be on her. Before she could respond, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to find Jason standing there, his posture stiff, his eyes intense. He glanced at her, then gave a small nod. "Good luck," he said, his voice quieter than Ava expected. "Thanks," Ava replied, a little taken aback. It was the first time Jason had wished her luck, and it caught her off guard. There was something different about him today, something that made her wonder if he was more than just a competitor in this moment. Jason hesitated before turning to leave. "You're going to do great," he added, with a sincerity that surprised her even more. With that, he walked off, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Ava stood still for a moment, processing the exchange. Had the rivalry between them shifted? Or was this just a moment of respect born from shared experience? She didn't know, but one thing was certain, Jason wasn't the same person he had been at the start of the competition. When Ava's name was called, her heart skipped a beat. The crowd's applause thundered in the background, but all she could focus on was the stage ahead. She took a deep breath, pushing the nerves aside, and walked toward the piano. The stage was brighter than it had ever seemed before, and her steps echoed as she made her way to the bench. She sat down, placing her fingers on the keys. The audience fell silent. Ava closed her eyes for a brief moment, remembering the music she had practiced for so long. She wasn't just playing to compete anymore, she was playing for herself. She was playing to feel the music, to connect with it, to finally let go of the fear that had held her back for so long. With a deep breath, she began. The first few notes flowed from her fingertips, smooth and steady. Ava felt the music lift her, like she was being carried along by an invisible current. Each note fell into place, and as she continued to play, she let go of the pressure. There were no mistakes. There were no expectations, just the music and her. The piece was more than just a performance, it was a release. Each phrase of music felt like a weight being lifted off her shoulders. For the first time, she felt truly present. She wasn't worried about how she looked or how she sounded, she was just letting the music take over. As she reached the final passage, a wave of emotion washed over her. It was like everything she had been through, the fear, the doubts, the mistakes, had led her to this moment. She wasn't just playing the piano anymore. She was expressing everything she had been holding inside. She played with everything she had, pouring her heart into every note. When the final chord resonated through the auditorium, the silence was almost deafening. Ava sat there, her hands resting on the keys, her heart racing in her chest. She didn't know what to expect from the audience, but for the first time, she didn't care. Slowly, the silence was broken by a slow clap. Then, the applause erupted, louder than Ava had ever heard. It was overwhelming. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked out at the crowd, unsure of what she had just experienced. She had done it. She had faced everything, every fear, every doubt, and she had come out the other side. She stood up, bowing slightly, her legs trembling from the adrenaline. She didn't know if she had won the competition, but at that moment, it didn't matter. She had won something much more valuable, her own confidence, her own peace. As she walked backstage, she caught sight of Jason again. This time, he wasn't watching with the usual competitive fire in his eyes. Instead, he nodded to her in acknowledgement, his eyes filled with respect. Ava smiled, a genuine smile that wasn't about rivalry or competition, it was about the understanding that, in that moment, they were both changed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The applause still reverberated in Ava's ears as she made her way backstage. Her hands were still trembling from the performance, but there was a calmness settling inside her. She had done it. She had faced her fear, played from the heart, and let the music guide her. It didn't matter what happened next, she felt like a winner already. Backstage was a whirlwind of activity. Other performers were packing up their instruments, some chatting in small groups, others pacing nervously as they waited for the judge's decision. The air was thick with tension, but Ava tried her best to block it out. She had worked so hard for this, and now all she could do was wait. Emily appeared by her side, grinning from ear to ear. "You were amazing, Ava. I swear, you were in another zone up there." The audience was totally mesmerized. Ava smiled, feeling the weight of the day starting to catch up with her. "Thanks, Emily. I didn't think I'd make it through without completely messing up." "You didn't mess up. You just played it like it was your last performance. That was the best part. You owned it." Ava was about to respond when she noticed Jason out of the corner of her eye. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, staring at the floor. He wasn't talking to anyone, just lost in thought. There was a quiet intensity to him that Ava hadn't seen before. She wasn't sure if she should approach him or leave him to his own space. The whole competition had been tense between them, but now, after their unexpected moments of respect, she wasn't sure what to make of it. "Is everything okay with you?" Emily asked, nudging Ava slightly. Ava glanced at Jason again, hesitating. "I think so. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to process everything." Emily gave her a curious look. "What's going on?" "I don't know," Ava said, glancing at Jason again. "It's just, the way he's acting, it's different." "You mean Jason? The guy who's been eyeing you like you were a challenge the whole time?" Ava chuckled softly. "Yeah, but now it's. I don't know. Maybe he's finally realized we're not in a race against each other anymore. Emily raised an eyebrow. You think? Because if anyone's been trying to be top dog in this competition, it's definitely him. Ava nodded thoughtfully. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to understand him better. Before Emily could respond, the room grew suddenly quiet as the judges walked in, their serious expressions causing an immediate hush to fall over the group. The time had come. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as the head judge, Mr. Riley, stepped forward with an envelope in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for your outstanding performances today. You've all demonstrated an immense amount of talent and passion. It hasn't been easy to narrow down the final results, but we've come to a decision. The room was still. Ava could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. As you all know, the competition today was about more than just technical skill, Mr. Riley continued. It was about heart, passion, and the ability to push through the toughest of circumstances. Every one of you here has proven you have that in spades. Ava swallowed, the nerves creeping back in. She tried to breathe, tried to focus on her emotions, but the anticipation was almost suffocating. The judge opened the envelope. The third-place winner of this year's competition is Jason Holt. Jason's head snapped up at the sound of his name. For the briefest moment, Ava saw his eyes widen in surprise, but then he quickly masked it with a tight smile. He nodded and walked toward the judges with a collected, but disappointed expression. Ava's heart skipped a beat. Third place. Jason had been in the lead for so long, and now he was third. The news hit her harder than she expected. Even though she had no intention of making this about him, it still stung to see someone she had once seen as a rival take that hit. And the second-place winner is Emily Sanchez. Ava looked over at Emily, who had turned pale, her mouth slightly agape. Emily had been absolutely brilliant today, but second place. Ava didn't know whether to feel happy or surprised by the outcome. Emily didn't seem to know how to react, frozen for a moment before finally walking up to accept her prize. There was a cheer from the crowd, but Emily seemed almost lost in her own world. And finally, the winner of this year's competition. Ava Carter. Ava froze. Her heart stopped for a moment as the words sank in. She didn't hear the applause at first, just a rushing sound in her ears. Did he just say my name? Ava blinked, as if to clear her thoughts, before the reality of the situation hit her. She was the winner. The applause began to roar in her ears as she slowly made her way to the stage, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly. The lights were blinding, but Ava couldn't wipe the smile off her face. She felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, joy, disbelief, pride, but most of all, relief. She had made it. As she stood before the judges, receiving her trophy, she could feel the weight of the moment. She had come so far, far beyond what she had ever thought possible. The person who had started this competition unsure of herself, afraid to make a mistake, was now standing before everyone as the winner. The applause felt like a dream, a distant echo, but as the judge handed her the trophy, Ava could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. You did it, Emily whispered, giving her a hug from behind, her voice shaking with pride. Ava turned to look at her, still in shock, and pulled Emily into a tight embrace. We did it, she said softly, realizing for the first time that Emily's encouragement had helped her through some of the toughest moments. Jason stood nearby, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met across the room, and there was something unspoken between them. Acknowledgement. Respect. Maybe even admiration. Ava wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for sure, whatever had existed between them before, whatever had been born from rivalry, was now something different. They weren't competitors anymore. They were just people who had shared this journey. And in that moment, Ava realized she had won more than just the competition. She had found herself. The days following the competition felt like a blur to Ava. It was as if the moment she stepped off that stage, everything else had faded into the background. She had won, but what did that really mean? It wasn't just about the trophy anymore, it was about the transformation she had undergone, the journey that had led her here. The news of her victory spread quickly. Her friends, teachers, and family were all incredibly proud of her, but Ava was still processing the depth of it all. For so long, she had struggled with doubt and insecurity. Now, standing at the top, she was facing something she hadn't expected, a sense of uncertainty about what came next. Her phone buzzed with texts, congratulatory messages from everyone, from Emily to her parents to the few people she had met along the way. But there was one message that caught her eye. It was from Jason. "Congrats. You really earned it." Ava paused before responding. She had been meaning to reach out to him, but she wasn't sure what to say. The competition had changed things between them, but there was still a lingering tension. What had started as rivalry had transformed into something else, something Ava couldn't quite put into words. After a moment, she typed a simple reply. "Thanks, Jason. You were great too. I think we both learned something from this." She hesitated again before hitting send. She had no idea how he would take it, but somehow, it felt like the right thing to say. The reply came almost instantly. "Yeah. I think we did." Ava smiled softly as she read the message. It was brief, but there was an understanding in his words that made her feel at ease. Maybe they weren't so different after all. A few days later, Ava found herself walking into the same music hall where it had all started. This time, she wasn't a competitor. She wasn't there to face the judges or worry about ranking. She was just there to play. The trophy was sitting at home on her desk, but it felt like a distant memory now. As she entered the hall, she noticed Jason already sitting at the piano, deep in concentration. He was practicing the same piece he had performed during the competition, his fingers dancing over the keys with precision. Ava hesitated for a moment, watching him, unsure of what to do. But then he looked up and caught her eye. He didn't smile or wave, but there was a recognition between them. A silent acknowledgement. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Didn't expect to see you here." Ava shrugged, walking over to the nearby bench. "Thought I'd come play. It's been a while since I just played without the pressure." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I get that. It's different without the competition hanging over you." There was a quiet moment between them, and for the first time, Ava wasn't trying to analyze every word or gesture. She just felt calm. She had no idea what Jason's plans were after the competition, but for now, she didn't need to know. "You know," Ava began, breaking the silence, "I think I get it now. This whole thing, the competition, the pressure. It's not about winning or losing. It's about why we play. And what it makes us feel." Jason looked at her with an almost curious expression. "You've changed." Ava smiled, but it wasn't a boastful smile. "Yeah, I guess I have. I didn't think I'd get this far, honestly. But I learned that sometimes, the best thing you can do is just show up and let it happen." Jason nodded slowly, as though he was mulling over her words. "Yeah, I guess that's true. I've been so focused on being the best, I forgot why I started playing in the first place." The words hung in the air, and Ava felt a shift. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about something deeper, a mutual respect that had developed between them, even through all the competition and rivalry. "I get that," Ava replied softly. "But it's not too late to remember." Jason didn't answer immediately, but he reached for his sheet music and started playing again. The melody was slow at first, almost hesitant, before gaining strength as his fingers found their rhythm. Ava listened, feeling the familiar pull of the music. There was something undeniably beautiful about his playing, even if it wasn't perfect. It was raw, honest, and unafraid. Ava picked up her own music, letting the notes guide her as she sat down at a nearby piano. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just played, two musicians lost in the beauty of the moment. Later that afternoon, Ava left the music hall with a feeling of peace she hadn't had in a long time. She hadn't just won the competition, she had won something far more valuable, a sense of self. Her heart was lighter than it had ever been, and the weight of her past struggles seemed to have lifted. Her phone buzzed again as she walked down the street. It was another message from Jason. "You were right. It's not about winning. I think I forgot that." Ava smiled as she read his words. Maybe, just maybe, they had both learned something from this competition. And maybe, just maybe, they would continue to grow from here, not as rivals, but as two people who had shared an unforgettable journey. That evening, as Ava sat at the dinner table with her family, her parents beamed at her. Her mom was asking all about the competition, her father was offering endless congratulations, but Ava's mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about the applause, the trophy, or the future accolades. She was thinking about the music. About the way it had transformed her, and about how much more there was to discover. For the first time, she felt like she was standing at the beginning of something new. She didn't know where it would lead, but one thing was clear, she was ready to follow the music wherever it took her. Weeks passed after the competition, and life slowly returned to its regular rhythm. Ava continued her lessons, practiced whenever she had a free moment, and tried to balance her time between school and the music that had become her sanctuary. But something was different now. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. There was a spark in her heart, an excitement for the future that had been missing for so long. One evening, as Ava sat at her piano, playing through a new piece she had been learning, her phone buzzed across the table. She paused and reached for it, wondering who it might be. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hi, Ava. This is Mrs. Langston, from the Chamber Music Festival. I saw your performance in the competition, and I must say I was thoroughly impressed. Would you be interested in performing in our upcoming event?" Ava blinked in surprise. Mrs. Langston was the renowned director of the Chamber Music Festival, one of the most prestigious events for young musicians. To be invited to perform in such an event was something most musicians could only dream of. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her mind racing. Was this real? A part of her felt like she might be dreaming. She had only just begun to scratch the surface of her potential, and now she was being asked to perform in front of an elite audience. After a few moments of hesitation, Ava replied. "Thank you so much for the opportunity, Mrs. Langston. I would be honored to perform. Please let me know the details." The response came quickly. "I'll send you the full details soon. We'll be arranging a rehearsal with other performers as well, and I'll need you to send your preferred piece by next week. We're excited to have you join us." Ava read the message again, letting the words sink in. This was it. This was the break she had been waiting for. She felt a mix of emotions, excitement, nervousness, but most of all, a deep sense of gratitude. The next few days were a blur of preparations. Ava had to choose a piece to perform, practice it every chance she got, and get ready for the rehearsals that would soon follow. She was no longer just a student at the local high school, trying to make a name for herself in a small competition. She was now a part of something bigger, a prestigious event that would take her music to new heights. One afternoon, as she was practicing, her mother stepped into the room, her face bright with excitement. "You look like you're deep in thought," her mother said, leaning against the doorframe. Ava smiled, her eyes still focused on the sheet music. "I'm just getting ready for the festival. It's all happening so fast." Her mother came over, sitting down beside her at the piano. "I can see how much this means to you. You've come such a long way, Ava. You should be so proud of yourself." Ava let out a soft sigh, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It feels like everything's happening all at once. I'm not sure I'm ready for this." What if I mess up? Her mother smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. You've worked hard for this. You've always had talent, but what's made you shine is your heart. Remember that, no matter what happens. This is your moment, but it's not just about the performance. It's about sharing something that's a part of you. Ava nodded, feeling the weight of her mother's words settle deep within her. It wasn't just about playing the perfect notes. It was about playing from the heart, and sharing that passion with others. The day of the rehearsal arrived, and Ava felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach as she entered the grand concert hall. It was even more beautiful than she had imagined. The tall, ornate ceilings, the rich, wooden floors, the gleaming pianos, it all felt like a dream. She wasn't the only one there. Other musicians were setting up, tuning their instruments, chatting quietly with one another. Some of them were familiar, from previous competitions or music events, while others were strangers, people who had achieved success in their own right. But it didn't matter to Ava. She was no longer comparing herself to anyone. She had earned this place, and she was going to make the most of it. As the rehearsal began, Ava joined the other musicians at the piano, her hands shaking slightly as she sat down. She glanced around the room at the other performers, wondering who would be the most challenging. But she quickly realized that there was no need for competition now. Everyone here had already proven themselves. This was about collaboration, not rivalry. Mrs. Langston stood at the front, her eyes sharp and focused. Everyone, we'll begin with some basic warm-up exercises. Get comfortable, relax your shoulders, and let's focus on the music. Remember, we're here to create something beautiful together. Ava took a deep breath and began to play. The notes flowed from her fingers, smooth and effortless, the way they had been doing in her practice sessions. But now, surrounded by such talented musicians, she could feel the weight of the moment. The piece she had chosen was one she had learned recently, but it had come to mean so much to her. It was both delicate and powerful, a piece that spoke to the soul. As she played, she let herself loose in the music, allowing the emotions of the piece to carry her. She didn't worry about making a mistake, didn't worry about how others would perceive her. She just played. And when the rehearsal was over, Mrs. Langston approached her with a smile. Ava, that was stunning. I'm so glad you decided to join us. Your playing is so full of life. Keep it up. Ava's heart soared. It was a small compliment, but it meant the world to her. She felt as if all of her hard work, all of the doubts she had faced, had led her to this very moment. She was no longer the insecure girl who was afraid of making mistakes. She was a musician, standing on the threshold of something great. As the days passed, Ava continued to rehearse, the performance drawing nearer with each passing moment. The other performers were equally focused, and the energy in the air grew more intense. But Ava didn't let it overwhelm her. She stayed grounded in the music, allowing it to guide her through each practice session. The day of the festival was finally upon her, and Ava couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. She had come so far, but now it was time to step onto the stage again. Not as a competitor, but as an artist, one who had something to say through the music. As she stood backstage, waiting for her turn, she felt a calmness wash over her. She wasn't nervous anymore. She wasn't afraid of messing up. This was her moment to share the music, to give it her all. And when the curtain rose, Ava stepped into the spotlight, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was sharing a piece of herself with the world. Ava's fingers hovered above the keys of the piano as she sat on the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment. The concert hall was quiet, save for the faint rustling of the audience, adjusting in their seats. It felt surreal. The weight of everything, her journey, her growth, the struggles she had overcome, all seemed to culminate in this one moment. She had been to many competitions before, but this was different. This wasn't just another contest. It wasn't about beating someone else. This was about pouring everything she had into the music, letting it carry her to a place beyond the physical world. This was her chance to show the audience who she truly was as an artist. A deep breath. Then, her fingers touched the piano keys. The opening notes of the piece she had chosen filled the room, delicate and soft, almost like a whisper. It was a composition she had always loved, one that spoke to her heart. It wasn't flashy or overly complex, but it was deeply emotional. Every note was a piece of her story, every pause an invitation for the audience to listen, to feel. As she played, Ava's nerves seemed to dissolve into the music. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her eyes closed as she let the music take her over. The audience faded away. There was only the piano, and the delicate interplay of sound that filled the space between her and the world. The piece gradually built in intensity, rising higher and higher, until it reached its crescendo. Each note came from deep within her, and she could feel the music resonating not only through her fingertips but through every fiber of her being. She had never felt so alive, so completely connected to her art. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the music slowed again, returning to a gentle, quiet melody. The final notes lingered in the air, reverberating through the hall, as Ava brought the piece to a delicate close. There was silence for a moment, and then the audience erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, but Ava barely registered it. She remained seated at the piano, her hands trembling slightly as the last echoes of the performance faded away. She had done it. She had given everything she had, and now the rest was out of her hands. As she stood up, the applause grew louder. She smiled, nodding to the audience, but her heart was racing. This moment, this incredible moment, was everything she had worked for. But more than that, it was about the connection. She had shared something deeply personal with them, and they had accepted it. She had truly felt seen, heard, and understood. Backstage, Ava was greeted by Mrs. Langston, who was beaming with pride. "Ava, that was absolutely beautiful," she said, her voice full of admiration. "You've got such a gift. I knew when I heard you at the rehearsal that you were something special, but you've just proven it. You've made this performance unforgettable." Ava could hardly believe it. Mrs. Langston, the woman who had orchestrated this entire festival, was praising her. It felt surreal. Ava hadn't expected this kind of response, but it filled her with a deep sense of pride and relief. She hadn't played for the applause or the accolades, she had played because the music was her truth. But hearing these words, knowing her performance had touched someone else, felt like a victory in itself. "Thank you," Ava said, her voice soft. "It means the world to me to hear that." As the night wore on, Ava had the chance to watch the other performers. Some were brilliant, their performances flawless and mesmerizing, but none of them felt quite like hers. None of them had her passion, her heart. And in that moment, she realized something important: she didn't need to be the best. She just needed to be true to herself. The evening came to a close, and Ava left the concert hall with her head held high. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though she had just unlocked a new chapter of her life. But there was one thing that still lingered in her mind: the connection she had made with the music, and with the audience. For the first time, she realized that this was what she was meant to do. It wasn't about competing or proving herself. It was about sharing her heart through music. As she stepped into the cool night air, she received a message. It was from Jason. "You were amazing tonight, Ava. Truly. I had no idea you had that much in you." Ava smiled at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had been thinking about Jason a lot lately. He had always been a bit of a mystery to her, competitive, sharp, driven, but there was something in his message that felt different. Maybe he had finally seen her for who she was. She quickly typed back. "Thank you, Jason. It means a lot to hear that from you." The reply came almost immediately. "No problem. You've got something special, Ava. Don't forget that. Ava sat back, a soft smile on her face. Maybe things had changed between them, maybe they were no longer just competitors. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, one that had formed over the past months. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she didn't feel the need to rush it. The following weeks were a whirlwind of new opportunities. Mrs. Langston reached out to Ava with more invitations to perform in various events, and Ava's name began to circulate among music circles in a way it never had before. She was invited to master classes, given the chance to collaborate with renowned musicians, and even offered a scholarship to a prestigious music academy. But the most surprising of all was the unexpected phone call she received one afternoon. "Ava, this is James Hughes from the National Music Foundation," the voice on the other end said. "We've been following your performances, and we're very impressed with your talent. We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to attend our summer music program in Italy. It's an incredible opportunity for young musicians like yourself. Are you interested?" Ava could hardly believe what she was hearing. Italy. A summer music program with world-class instructors. It sounded like a dream come true. "Yes," she replied immediately, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'm interested. I would love that." Later that day, as Ava sat at her piano, staring at the phone in disbelief, a sense of wonder swept over her. It felt like the world was opening up for her in ways she had never imagined. She had always dreamed of traveling, of immersing herself in music on a global scale, but now, those dreams were becoming reality. She wasn't just a small-town girl anymore. She was a musician with a future ahead of her, one that was full of promise, challenge, and discovery. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ava's heart raced with excitement as the day of her departure approached. The scholarship to the National Music Foundation's summer program in Italy was more than just a chance to study with world-class instructors, it was a chance to see the world in a new light, to experience music in a way she never had before. Her mind swirled with thoughts of what the future would hold. In the weeks leading up to her departure, Ava prepared feverishly. She brushed up on the pieces she would perform, packed her bags, and made sure all the logistical details were in place. But as much as she was looking forward to the opportunity, she couldn't help but feel a bit nervous about leaving home for the first time. Her family was supportive, of course, but they were also going to miss her terribly. Her mom, in particular, was struggling with the idea of having Ava so far away for an extended period. The night before she was set to leave, Ava sat with her mom at the kitchen table. The house was quieter than usual, and her mother's gaze was soft as she gazed out the window. "You're going to do amazing things, Ava. I just know it," her mom said, breaking the silence. "But you're not going to forget where you came from, right?" Ava smiled, a bittersweet feeling rising in her chest. "I promise, Mom. No matter where I go, no matter what happens, this will always be home. You'll always be my home." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Just remember to take care of yourself. Stay true to who you are, and don't let the world change you." Ava squeezed her mom's hand. "I won't. I'll come back and tell you all about it. And maybe even bring you a nice souvenir from Italy." Her mother chuckled softly, but Ava could see the pride and worry mixed in her eyes. "I can't wait to hear everything, sweetheart. Go and make the most of this." The next morning, Ava boarded the plane that would take her across the ocean to Italy. It was her first international flight, and everything felt like a whirlwind. The flight was long, and she tried to distract herself by reading and listening to music, but her thoughts kept drifting back to home. Would she really fit in with the other students at the program? Would she be able to keep up with the demanding pace of the program? As the plane finally touched down in Rome, Ava felt a rush of excitement. She had never traveled this far before, and the unfamiliar language, the bustling streets, the vibrant culture, it all felt like stepping into a dream. After a few days in Rome, Ava and the other students were transported to a small, picturesque village nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany. The music academy was located in an old villa, surrounded by vineyards and lush greenery. The atmosphere was serene, and Ava couldn't believe she was going to be spending the next few months in such a beautiful place. Her first days at the academy were a blur of introductions, rehearsals, and settling into her new surroundings. There were students from all over the world. Some of them spoke fluent Italian, some spoke English, and others spoke languages Ava had never even heard of. But despite the differences, they all shared one common bond, a deep love for music. Ava was assigned a practice room and began to settle into the routine of daily lessons and rehearsals. Each morning began with group warm-ups, followed by one-on-one lessons with a renowned piano instructor. In the afternoons, the students would gather for group practice sessions, where they worked together on different pieces and refined their techniques. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. Every day, Ava was pushed to her limits, challenged in ways she had never been before. The other students were incredibly talented, and sometimes Ava felt like she was struggling to keep up. But every time she sat down at the piano, she found herself pushing past her doubts and fears, reminding herself that this was why she was here. To grow. To learn. To become the musician she had always dreamed of being. One evening, after a particularly intense practice session, Ava sat outside on the villa's terrace, looking out over the Tuscan countryside. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the hills. She felt a deep sense of peace, as though the entire world had slowed down just for her. "You look like you found your place," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Ava turned to see one of the other students, a tall boy with messy brown hair and a relaxed smile. He had been in a few of her group sessions and seemed to have a quiet confidence about him. Ava smiled. It's so beautiful here. I don't think I've ever felt so inspired." The boy sat down next to her. "It has that effect on people. It's hard not to get lost in the music when you're surrounded by this kind of beauty." Ava nodded, her eyes drifting to the horizon. "I feel like I'm learning more in these few days than I did in years back home. But it's overwhelming, too. The other students, they're so good. I don't know if I'm even close to their level." The boy raised an eyebrow. "You'll get there. You're already better than most people I know, and you've got something the others don't. Heart." Ava turned to look at him, surprised by his words. "Heart?" He nodded. "Yeah. Most of the people here are technical geniuses, but they don't have that emotional connection to their music. You do. It's clear in the way you play. Keep that." Ava felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thanks. That means a lot." For the first time since she arrived in Italy, she felt a sense of reassurance. Maybe she wasn't the most technically proficient, but she had something unique. She had a connection to the music, a passion that went beyond just playing the notes. That was something no one could teach. As the days turned into weeks, Ava's confidence grew. She continued to push herself, mastering new pieces and refining her technique. Her classmates became more than just fellow musicians, they became friends, and they shared their own struggles, their own fears, and their own dreams. She had found a sense of belonging here, in this small village surrounded by vineyards and music. And, with every practice session, every performance, Ava was getting closer to the musician she had always wanted to be. But even as she thrived in this new environment, one thing weighed heavily on her mind: the upcoming concert at the end of the program. It was the final performance of the summer, and Ava had been selected to perform a solo piece. The pressure was mounting, and as the day of the concert drew near, she couldn't shake the fear that she wouldn't be ready. She was surrounded by so much talent, what if she wasn't good enough? But then, in a quiet moment, she remembered the boy's words. Heart. And in that moment, Ava realized something. She had everything she needed within her. All she had to do was trust in herself, in the music, and in the journey she had taken to get here. The day of the concert had arrived. Ava woke up early, the soft light of the Tuscan sun filtering through her window. Her heart was racing, a mix of nerves and excitement swirling inside her. She had been practicing for this moment for weeks, but now that it was finally here, everything felt surreal. It was hard to believe that the summer was almost over, that her time in Italy was coming to a close. As she sat on the edge of her bed, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The past few months had been transformative. She had grown as a musician, yes, but more than that, she had grown as a person. The experiences, the people, the challenges, everything had shaped her in ways she hadn't expected. And now, she was about to take the stage and show the world what she had learned. The piece she had chosen to perform was a challenging one, full of both delicate, introspective moments and bold, sweeping passages. It was a piece that had always resonated with her, and she knew it would push her to her limits. But she also knew that it was the perfect piece for this moment. She was ready. Her classmates were already gathering in the performance hall as Ava arrived. The air was thick with anticipation, and she could feel the energy in the room. The room was grand, with tall ceilings and walls adorned with ornate paintings and gilded frames. The stage was lit with soft, warm lights, and the grand piano in the center seemed to beckon her forward. "Hey, Ava. You ready for tonight?" Jason's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see him approaching, a grin on his face. He looked every bit as nervous as she felt. Ava smiled back, feeling a wave of comfort wash over her. "I think so. I mean, I've been practicing forever, so. I hope I'm ready." Jason nodded, his expression softening. "You're going to be great. You've come so far since we first met, and I'm honestly amazed by how much you've grown. You've got this." Ava appreciated his words, but she still couldn't shake the butterflies in her stomach. The final performance was a big deal. This wasn't just any concert, it was the culmination of everything she had worked for during her time at the academy. The pressure was on, but she had come too far to let fear hold her back. She took a few moments to herself before the concert began, sitting in one of the backstage rooms, her hands folded in her lap. She closed her eyes and replayed the piece in her mind, imagining the flow of the music, the movements of her hands on the keys. And then, just as the sound of the audience filtering into the hall reached her ears, she knew. She knew this was the moment. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about the music. It was about connecting with the audience, sharing a part of herself that no words could express. The concert began with a few performances from other students, each one showcasing their unique talents. There were violin solos, vocal performances, and duets, each more impressive than the last. But Ava's mind was focused entirely on the piano. When her name was called, she stood up, her heart thudding in her chest. She walked to the stage, the spotlight following her every step. As she sat at the piano, the silence in the room seemed to stretch on forever. The audience was waiting, all eyes on her. Ava placed her hands on the keys, taking a moment to center herself. And then, without another thought, she began. The opening notes of the piece filled the hall, soft and delicate, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through the darkness. Ava's fingers moved fluidly over the keys, the music flowing effortlessly from her hands. She could feel the emotion of the piece coursing through her, each note a reflection of her journey. Every chord, every phrase, spoke of the struggles she had faced, the doubts she had overcome, and the strength she had discovered within herself. The music grew in intensity, her fingers flying across the keys with precision and power. As she played, the audience seemed to disappear. It was just her and the piano, the music the only thing that mattered. The world outside faded away, and all that was left was the beauty of the moment. Her performance reached its crescendo, the final notes ringing out in the hall, hanging in the air like a dream. She played the final chord, letting the sound linger before she slowly pulled her hands away from the keys. The room was silent for a heartbeat, and then the audience erupted into applause. Ava's heart raced in her chest, but this time, it was different. She felt no fear, no doubt. Only a deep, abiding sense of peace. She had given everything she had to that performance, and the music had spoken for her. She stood up, her legs shaky, and bowed to the audience. She could see the admiration in their eyes, and the sense of pride she felt was overwhelming. The other students clapped for her, their applause just as genuine as the audience's. Jason was the first to reach her backstage, a wide grin on his face. "I knew you had it in you. That was incredible, Ava. You played with so much heart." Ava smiled, still catching her breath. "Thank you. It feels surreal. You earned it." "You've come such a long way," Jason said, his voice full of admiration. "I'm proud of you." As the night wore on, Ava mingled with the other students, the sense of accomplishment settling in. The performance was over, but the memories of this experience would stay with her forever. She had faced her fears, pushed herself to her limits, and emerged stronger than ever. But there was still one more thing that needed to be addressed, the conversation she had been putting off with Jason. They had been friends, rivals, and co-conspirators in their shared journey, but Ava felt like there was more between them now. More than just the shared love of music. There was a connection, a spark that had been building throughout the summer. And as the evening wound down, she knew she couldn't leave without having that conversation. She found him outside the hall, standing by the stone railing overlooking the courtyard, the soft evening light casting a golden glow over his features. "Hey, Jason," Ava called softly, approaching him. He turned, his face lighting up as he saw her. "Hey. You're amazing, you know that, right?" Ava smiled, her heart fluttering. "I just wanted to say thank you. You've been a huge part of this journey for me, pushing me to be better, challenging me to grow. I don't think I could have done it without you." Jason's expression softened, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. "You're welcome, Ava. But it's not just me. You did this. You took the chance, and you gave it everything you had." Ava nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah. I guess I did. But there's still one thing I need to say. I've been thinking about us, about what we are. And I don't want to leave here without knowing where we stand." Jason looked at her, his gaze intense. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ava, I've been thinking about that too. And I don't want to leave without you knowing that I care about you. Not just as a friend, not just as a competitor, but as something more." Ava's heart leapt in her chest, and for a moment, everything else faded away. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. "I care about you too, Jason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I ever thought possible." And as they stood there, hand in hand, under the soft glow of the Tuscan sky, Ava knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life. A chapter filled with love, music, and endless possibilities. The last few days in Italy passed in a blur. The final concert had been a resounding success, and with the summer program coming to an end, Ava felt both exhilarated and melancholy. The idea of leaving this beautiful place, the friends she had made, and the music that had shaped her summer was bittersweet. But deep down, she knew it was time to go back home. Ava spent her last hours in the villa reflecting on the journey she had undertaken. It hadn't just been about learning new techniques or playing at a higher level, it had been about finding herself, about connecting with a part of her soul that only music seemed to reveal. She was sitting on the villa's terrace, watching the sunset, when Jason joined her, his expression thoughtful. "This place, it feels like a dream," Ava said, her voice quiet, almost reverent. "I've learned so much here, not just about music, but about who I am. And I don't want to lose that, you know." Jason sat down beside her, gazing at the horizon. "You won't lose it. You've grown too much, Ava. Music doesn't just leave you, it becomes part of you. And the person you are now? She's going to carry that forward, wherever you go. Ava smiled, grateful for his words. You really think so? I know so, Jason replied, his voice steady. You've made it through everything, all the challenges, all the doubts. You've proven to yourself that you can do this. Now it's about what you do with it. Ava nodded, her heart swelling. She couldn't imagine how she would have gotten through this summer without Jason by her side. It wasn't just the music that had brought them close, it was the support they had given each other. After a long pause, Jason turned to her. So, what happens next? Are you going to keep playing the piano? Going to college, maybe? Ava took a deep breath, her mind swirling with possibilities. She had been accepted to a prestigious music school back home before the program started, but now that she had experienced this new world of music, she wondered if she could ever go back to her old life. Could she continue living in the small town, or was there more for her out there? More music, more growth, more opportunities. I don't know yet, Ava confessed. But I do know that I can't stop playing. It's too much a part of me now. Jason smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. That's all I need to hear. Whatever path you choose, I know you're going to make it. Ava turned to face him, her heart aching a little. She had enjoyed their friendship, the deep connection they had formed over the summer. But now that the program was ending, she wasn't sure what their relationship would look like moving forward. Jason, she began softly, what happens when we go back home? Will we still stay in touch? Jason's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. I think we'll find a way. Maybe we'll see each other again, maybe not. But the way I see it, we both have our own paths to follow now. Ava squeezed his hand, feeling a rush of emotion. I'm going to miss you. Me too, Jason said, his voice quiet. But I'll always be here for you. Just like I know you'll be there for me. It was a bittersweet farewell, one that neither of them could fully prepare for. They both knew that their lives were about to take different turns, but their bond would always remain, tethered by the music that had brought them together in the first place. The flight back home was a quiet one for Ava. She spent the hours in the air thinking about everything she had experienced, the highs and lows, the triumphs and setbacks, the lessons learned both at the piano and in life. It had been the summer of her life, and now it was time to face the next chapter. As the plane descended toward her hometown, Ava's heart fluttered with anticipation. She was excited to return, but she also knew that she had changed. No longer was she the unsure girl who had entered the program back in Italy. She was stronger, more confident, and determined to continue her journey. Her mom was waiting for her at the airport, a warm smile on her face as she waved Ava over. The reunion was joyful, filled with hugs and laughter, but also an unspoken understanding that things were different now. Ava had grown up, and she wasn't the same girl who had left just a few months ago. As they drove home, Ava's mom asked about Italy, her eyes full of curiosity. Ava shared the highlights of the program, the beautiful sights, the incredible music, and the unforgettable friends she had made. But she didn't just talk about the surface-level experiences. She talked about how she had changed, how the music had taught her things that were bigger than the notes on the page. I think I've found my place, Ava said, her voice filled with a sense of certainty that surprised even her. I know what I want to do. And I don't want to waste any more time wondering if I'm good enough. I know I am. Her mom smiled, her eyes misting with pride. I'm so proud of you, Ava. Whatever you decide to do, I know you're going to do great things. Ava smiled back, a weight lifting off her shoulders. It felt good to say those words aloud. It felt even better to know that she was ready for whatever came next. Back home, Ava dove right back into her studies. But now, her approach was different. No longer was she merely preparing for the next recital or performance. She was preparing for her future. She had the tools, the talent, and the determination to forge ahead. She also decided to stay in touch with Jason. Their connection, though it had started as a friendship, had become something more, something deep and unspoken. They exchanged letters, emails, and sometimes even video chats. The distance was hard, but they both knew that the bond they had shared was strong enough to last. And as the months passed, Ava continued to flourish. She became more involved in her local music community, teaching younger students, composing her own pieces, and participating in local performances. Her skills grew, but more importantly, so did her sense of self. She no longer doubted her worth or her place in the world of music. Then, one day, an unexpected email arrived. It was from the National Music Foundation, inviting her to perform in a prestigious international music competition in Paris. The opportunity was a dream come true, one that would push her to new heights and challenge her in ways she couldn't even imagine. And just like that, Ava knew that the journey she had started in Italy was far from over. She had only just begun. Ava stared at the email screen in disbelief. She had opened it expecting another routine update, but instead, she was staring at the most exciting news she'd received since she had first set foot in Italy. The National Music Foundation was inviting her to participate in an international piano competition in Paris. The email was professional but warm, detailing the opportunity to perform among some of the best young pianists in the world. She could hardly believe it. She had always dreamed of performing on an international stage, but now it was actually happening. The rush of emotions hit her all at once, excitement, disbelief, and a flutter of nervousness. She felt the familiar spark of anticipation as she thought about the journey ahead. But beneath it all, she also felt a quiet certainty. She was ready for this. She quickly forwarded the email to her mom, who was at work, and then picked up her phone to call Jason. The timing was perfect, he was due for a break from his practice session, and Ava needed to hear a familiar voice. "Hey, Ava. What's up?" Jason answered after the first ring, his tone bright. "I got in," Ava said, her voice trembling with excitement. "I got into the competition in Paris. The National Music Foundation invited me." For a split second, there was silence on the other end of the line, and then Jason's joyful exclamation came through. "No way. Ava, that's incredible. I knew you could do it, but, Paris. That's a whole new level." Ava laughed, her excitement bubbling over. "I know, right? I don't even know what to do with myself. I'm in shock. It's real, though. They want me to compete with some of the best. I don't even know if I'm good enough for that." "Stop," Jason said, his voice serious but encouraging. "You're not just good enough, you're more than good enough. This is your moment, Ava. You've earned this. You've been working for this for so long." Ava smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Jason's belief in her had been one of the things that had kept her going throughout the toughest times of the past months. "Thanks, Jason. That means everything." They chatted a little longer, and Jason promised to send her some encouraging messages before the competition. He told her that no matter what happened in Paris, the experience itself would be worth it. Ava spent the next few days immersed in preparations. The competition was less than 2 months away, and she knew that she needed to be at her best. She practiced for hours every day, revisiting the pieces that had brought her to this point, but also pushing herself to learn new material, pieces that were more complex and challenging. However, as she sat at the piano, she realized there was something different this time. She was no longer playing with doubt, as she had done in the past. There was no fear of imperfection, no voice whispering that she wasn't good enough. This time, it was all about the joy of playing, the rush of feeling the music pulse through her fingers. She was ready. The weeks passed quickly, and before she knew it, Ava was on a plane to Paris. The City of Lights, the heart of classical music, was a dream come true for her. As the plane touched down, she felt a surge of excitement. It was one thing to visit Paris as a tourist, but this was different. This time, she was here as a musician, as a competitor, and as someone who had worked hard to earn a place among the best. When she arrived at the competition venue, it was everything she had imagined and more. The Palais de Congrès was grand, with soaring ceilings and elegant columns. It felt like stepping into history itself, surrounded by the echoes of past musicians and the weight of tradition. The other contestants were just as impressive. Ava saw young pianists from all over the world, some of them familiar faces from previous competitions, others strangers with the same drive and determination in their eyes. There was a sense of camaraderie among them, a shared understanding that they were all there for the same reason, to push their limits, to challenge themselves, and to share their love of music with the world. Ava's first few days in Paris were filled with rehearsals and practice sessions, as well as meeting with the other competitors. She found herself drawn to a young pianist from Japan named Haruto, whose playing was both technical and deeply emotional. The two exchanged ideas about music and technique, and she found his perspective refreshing. But it wasn't just the competition that was pushing Ava to grow, it was the city itself. Paris seemed to breathe music. Everywhere she went, she was surrounded by the sounds of violinists in the metro, street performers playing grand piano outside the cafes, and even impromptu jazz sessions in the parks. The entire city was a symphony, and Ava felt more inspired than ever before. One afternoon, after an intense practice session, Ava decided to take a walk through the city to clear her mind. She wandered down cobblestone streets, passing by beautiful historic buildings and stopping occasionally to watch a street performer. She found herself drawn to the Seine River, where the water sparkled under the afternoon sun. It was here, by the river, that she received a message from her mom. It was a simple text, but the words made Ava pause. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you. You've already won, Ava. You're not just a musician, you're someone who's found their voice, their purpose." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read her mom's message. She had worked so hard to get here, but now it wasn't about the competition or the accolades. It was about the journey, the path she had walked to get to this point, the growth, and the realization that she had already achieved so much. As Ava stood by the river, she thought of Jason, of her friends back home, and of all the people who had believed in her. They had all been part of her story, part of her journey. And no matter the outcome of the competition, she knew she had already become the person she was meant to be. The next day, the competition began. Ava took the stage with the same calm confidence she had carried throughout her journey. When she sat down at the grand piano, her fingers found the keys with ease, each note ringing out with clarity and purpose. The music she played wasn't just the product of practice, it was the culmination of every experience, every moment of doubt, every breakthrough. It was the voice she had found within herself, and as the final chords of her performance echoed through the hall, Ava knew that she had given everything she had. The audience's applause was deafening, but in that moment, Ava felt a deep sense of peace. She had come so far, and no matter what the judges decided, she knew this experience would stay with her forever. The days following Ava's performance at the competition were filled with anticipation. The atmosphere in Paris was electric, and she could feel the buzz of excitement all around her. Contestants were still warming up for their performances, and the pressure in the air was palpable. But Ava wasn't focused on them. She was focused on her own journey, the one that had led her to Paris in the first place. Her performance had been a success in her own eyes. The music had flowed effortlessly from her fingers, and as she had played, it had felt as though the world around her had disappeared. For that brief moment, it was just her and the music, a connection that transcended any competition. It had been the purest experience of her life. But now, as the competition neared its conclusion, she was forced to confront the one thing she had been avoiding since she had stepped onto that grand stage, the judgment. The final round of the competition was drawing closer, and so was the announcement of the winners. Ava had been told that the top 3 finalists would be given the opportunity to perform at a grand concert, but even more importantly, they would earn international recognition. The stakes were high, and Ava couldn't help but feel a mixture of anxiety and hope. In the days leading up to the announcement, Ava had tried her best to stay focused on her practice. She continued to play, but it felt different now. The weight of the impending results hung over her every move at the piano. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about proving herself, not just to others, but to herself. Could she truly belong on this stage? Was she truly enough? Stop that, Ava muttered to herself one evening as she practiced alone in the competition hall. She was staring at her reflection in the polished surface of the piano, her hands frozen on the keys. Why are you doubting yourself? Ava exhaled sharply and let her fingers drift to the keys. She needed to silence the noise in her mind. Her heart beat a little faster as she played, but gradually, she fell back into the flow of the music. The same calmness, the same sense of purpose that had driven her from the very start returned. She wasn't here to win for the validation. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. She was here because music was her truth, and this was her moment to share it. The night before the results were announced, Ava sat on the balcony of her hotel room, watching the lights of Paris twinkle below. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, a realization that she had already achieved something incredible. Regardless of what would happen tomorrow, she knew that this experience had changed her life. She had traveled halfway across the world, met people who would forever shape her, and pushed herself beyond limits she didn't even know she had. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text message from Jason. "I'm so proud of you, Ava. Win or lose, you've already made it. Just remember why you started. The rest will take care of itself." Ava's eyes filled with tears as she read the message. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. In that moment, she understood, Jason was right. The journey had always been about finding her voice, not about the recognition. With a deep breath, she typed back, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. "Thank you, Jason. I think I'm starting to understand that. I'll always remember this journey, no matter what happens." She leaned back in her chair, gazing at the skyline. Tomorrow was the big day, but she had made her peace. Her true victory had already been realized. The next afternoon, the finalists gathered in a grand hall for the announcement of the results. It was a formal event, with judges, media personnel, and other musicians in attendance. Ava stood among the competitors, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for her name to be called, or not. The announcer stepped onto the stage, and the room quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to announce the winners of the National Music Foundation's International Piano Competition," he said. His voice echoed through the hall as he opened the envelope. In third place, from the United States, Ava Mitchell. Ava's heart stopped. For a moment, everything around her seemed to fade. She couldn't quite process what had just happened. Third place. She had done it. She had made it. She had earned her spot among the top contenders. It wasn't first place, but it didn't matter. The validation, the recognition, it was enough. More than enough. The applause erupted around her, and she forced herself to smile through the wave of emotions flooding her body. She stood up to accept the recognition, her legs shaky, but her heart soaring. As she walked up to the stage, she was handed a trophy and a certificate, but more than anything, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The true reward had never been the title or the accolades, it had always been the journey she had taken to get here. Thank you all so much," she said into the microphone, her voice shaking slightly as she addressed the audience. "This experience has been life-changing for me. I'm just grateful to be here, surrounded by such talented musicians. This is only the beginning for me." The applause that followed felt like a wave crashing over her. But Ava knew, she had already won in so many ways. That evening, as Ava reflected on her experience, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had done more than just participate in a competition. She had grown. She had faced her fears and overcome them. And most importantly, she had discovered the music within herself that had always been there, waiting to be expressed. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from her mom. "You did it, Ava. I'm so proud of you. You've proven to yourself what you're capable of, and nothing can take that away." Ava wiped away a tear, reading the message again. "I couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for always believing in me." The text from her mom was all she needed to hear. She had done it. She had made her mark on the world, and she had learned the most important lesson of all: her music was her truth, and it would always guide her. Ava stood on the edge of the stage, looking out into the audience, her trophy in hand. The competition was over, but the weight of it all hadn't quite hit her. 3rd place. She had done it. Not first, but third, an achievement that, only months ago, had seemed far out of reach. The applause was still echoing in her ears, but all she could think about now was what came next. The journey had been incredible. From the long hours of practice to the moments of self-doubt, to the fear that had crept up when she thought she wasn't enough, Ava had fought through it all. But now, as she stood in Paris with her hard-earned trophy, she knew that this was only the beginning. She walked backstage, still trying to process everything. Her phone buzzed once more, and when she checked the screen, it was a message from Jason. "3rd place, Ava. That's incredible. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you." She couldn't help but smile. Jason had been there every step of the way, always encouraging her, always believing in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. "Thank you, Jason. It's overwhelming, but I'm so grateful. I couldn't have done it without your support." She typed quickly before putting the phone back in her pocket. She took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway, where other contestants were mingling and congratulating each other. There was a palpable sense of camaraderie among them now, as they shared this moment of triumph and relief together. For many of them, it had been a long road too, and Ava couldn't help but feel a deep respect for each one of them. As the night went on, the event began to wind down, but Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. It wasn't just about winning or losing anymore, it was about the connections she had made, the way she had grown, and the person she was becoming. She found herself standing in front of a large, framed picture of the cityscape of Paris, her reflection mingling with the lights in the background. For a moment, everything felt surreal. Paris. The competition. The music. The people who had cheered her on. She had come so far from the nervous girl who had walked into that first audition months ago. Ava wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived in Paris. She had discovered a new strength within herself, one that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with authenticity. It wasn't about being the best at everything, it was about embracing her love for music and trusting in herself. She knew that this was just one chapter of a much bigger story. The world of music was vast, and now, she had a foothold in it. But it wasn't just about competitions anymore. It was about what she could give to the world through her art. She wanted to inspire others the way she had been inspired, to share the power of music with people from all walks of life. Ava's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her mom. She quickly answered. "Ava. I'm watching the live stream of the awards ceremony. I couldn't be prouder of you." Her mom's voice was filled with emotion, and Ava could hear the joy in her words. "I'm proud of myself too, Mom," Ava replied, her voice full of gratitude. "I've come so far. This whole experience has been amazing, and I know it's just the beginning." "I'm glad to hear that, sweetheart. You've always had a special gift, and now the world is seeing it. You've worked so hard, and no matter where you go from here, I'll always be so proud of you." Ava closed her eyes, letting her mom's words wash over her. It was more than just validation, it was the love and encouragement she had always known, the unwavering belief that no matter the outcome, her worth was never defined by a title or a trophy. "I'm so grateful," Mom. For everything, Ava said, her voice cracking with emotion. You were always there for me when I needed you most. I'll always be here, Ava. Always. The following morning, as Ava packed her bags and prepared to leave Paris, she reflected on everything she had learned. The trip had given her more than just a trophy, it had given her confidence, clarity, and a renewed sense of purpose. She had made her mark, not just in the competition, but in her own heart. At the airport, she received another message, this one from Haruto, the young pianist from Japan she had befriended during the competition. Ava, it was an honor to perform with you in Paris. Your playing was beautiful, and your spirit is even more inspiring. Let's keep in touch and continue to grow together as musicians. Ava smiled, touched by his words. It was clear that she wasn't the only one who had gained something meaningful from this experience. The friendships she had formed were invaluable, and she knew that she would carry them with her long after the competition was over. As the plane lifted off, Ava gazed out the window, watching Paris shrink beneath her. It felt like a dream, a beautiful chapter that had come to an end. But she wasn't sad. She was eager to see where her music would take her next. There were no limits anymore, no boundaries. The world was full of possibilities, and Ava was ready to embrace them all. Back home in New York, life slowly returned to normal. Ava resumed her regular practice routine, but now with a new perspective. Her phone was full of messages from family, friends, and even people who had watched her performance in Paris. She responded to each one, grateful for the support. One evening, as Ava sat at her piano, she began composing something new. The notes flowed easily, filling the room with a melody she had never played before. It wasn't a competition piece, and it wasn't something that would impress judges or critics. It was simply a reflection of her heart, her journey, and everything she had learned in the past year. She thought back to those early days, when she had doubted herself, when she had felt like she would never make it. But now, as she played, she realized that everything had led her to this moment. Ava had found her voice, not just as a pianist, but as a person. And that, she realized, was the greatest prize of all. As she finished the final chord of her composition, Ava closed her eyes, a smile playing on her lips. She was ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?